Hi guys, so in this video we're going to go over some of the pre-reading for Robin Hood. We are also going to talk about the difference between fiction and nonfiction, and then your question at the end, one of your questions is going to be whether these stories are fiction or nonfiction. Okay, so I want to review the terms fiction and nonfiction first. Now I know we've talked about these before, but it is always important to just review things as we're going. So fiction is something that did not happen. Fiction is not real, okay? So there's some obvious examples of fiction, such as the fantasy stories that we've read before, where animals are talking, where there are mythical creatures, where people can fly. And then there are less obvious examples of fiction where they follow the same rules as the world we live in, but they're not true stories, okay? So I usually think of fiction as fake. So you put the F's together, fiction, fake. Now, nonfiction is when something did take place in real life. So non meaning not, so not fiction. So not fake, okay? So nonfiction is based on true stories. So when we've read some true accounts of things that happened, those would be nonfiction stories, okay? So articles that you read are nonfiction. Biographies about a person are nonfiction. So things that you looked up to do your technology projects were nonfiction, right? So we're going to talk a little bit about Robin Hood before we go into reading it. Now, I did post a PDF with 2 pages of this information and some more information. If you want to look through it, it is there for you. It is under materials and it is Robin Hood history, okay? So the Robin Hood stories are really old. Okay, they date very far back as an oral tradition, which means that people spoke them and told them to each other. So originally, we're not even sure how old they were because they were said out loud long before they were written down. They are considered folk stories that are stories that people have told to each other for just hundreds of years. And children often heard these stories from their parents and then would tell them to their children and kind of so on and so on. And that's usually how folk stories work. They center around this character of Robin Hood, who is considered an outlaw, which is a little bit more than just something that we would call criminal. An outlaw is somebody who lives outside of the law. So even if they were to be caught, they don't get trials. They don't get the protections of a normal law. They are out of the law, right? Now, originally, the Robin Hood stories were told as ballads, which were very long poem-like songs. And they all center around this character of Robin Hood, right? Who was Robin of Locksley, is usually who he is described as, Locksley being a town. And he gets the name Robin Hood from stories that we will see when we read. Now, Robin Hood himself is not, so there is no real historical person who was Robin Hood. Okay, but there are a lot of real people that are mixed into the stories, particularly Henry VII, King Richard, the Sheriff of Nottingham. Sherwood Forest is a real place, and we talk about all those things, but the character himself is not real. So the historical character is supposedly born between about 1116 1170, which puts him around the time of Henry II. Now, during this time, a lot of the kings in England were not actually English. They were from France because the French had invaded England. Now, this kind of separated a lot of the English people from wanting to work with these kings and everything. So they kind of were rebelling. They had wars. They had a lot of problems, right? Now, this guy, King Henry, wanted to be King Henry II, because there's going to be a lot of King Henrys, wanted to be the king of England and France. It was like his whole thing. So he kept raising money to have more wars, to have more military, to have more just power. He always wanted more and more power. Now, the way he raised this money was by raising everybody's taxes over and over and over again, right? So these people were paying these super high taxes, but they weren't actually getting anything back from it. The money was then just being used to kind of run these wars for this king that just wanted more and more power. Then these French guys started making laws against the English people, which were kind of really unfair. But these French guys really didn't care about the English that much, right? Because they were really from France. They just happened to be ruling in England at the time. But England didn't really mean anything to them. It wasn't their country. It wasn't anything that mattered to them. They didn't have this English pride or wanting to do things for each other. So, for example, the English people didn't own their own farms. They worked on farms that were owned by the French. They had to grow food and look after animals that then they had to give back in taxes. So they would grow this food, they would do this work, and then they would give it back, right? There were all these big forests where you would think, oh, I can go and go hunting and have food for my family. Except for only the kings and the royal people were actually allowed to hunt there. So they were not allowed to hunt there. They were not allowed to cut down trees there. They were not allowed to build anything there. So they had all of this space and all of these resources that they were not allowed to use. Now, the French would do kind of crazy, cruel things if they caught you doing any of these things. So if they were to catch you hunting your small animals, they would cut your fingers off as punishment. If you were to chop down wood, they're going to cut your ears off. If you hunted deer, they would blind you or even hang you because they considered that stealing from the king, right? So what they considered these Frenchmen basically to be the robbers. They were taking everything that these English people worked for. And Robin Hood became this folk hero who did these things that they weren't allowed to do. He hunted deer, he took from the forest, he lived on his own land, and he would give that all back to the poor. So if he hunted a deer and killed it, he wouldn't just eat it himself, he would go give it to people that didn't have any food. If he stole from a rich person, he would go give it out to the poor people. So he became kind of this folk hero, even though he was, technically a criminal. He's Robin Hood, the outlaw, right? But to them, he's fighting against laws that were unfair in the first place, and therefore he is the hero of these stories, right? Towards the end of all of this, King Henry passes away, and Richard becomes King of England, and Richard really doesn't care that much about all this stuff, so things kind of calm down and go back to normal. But the usual stories of Robin Hood center around King Henry II. Okay, so that is my quick little review. Remember, fiction is fake and nonfiction is real. So not fake, nonfiction. That is going to be one of your questions. There's also going to be a couple questions about some of the things that I talked about in this video, as well as an opinion question on how you feel about Robin Hood's crimes, where he takes from people who have and gives it to the poor. So those are all things to think about and look out for in your quiz. I hope you guys like this story, and we will start reading it soon. Thank you.